Chicago shimmered under the December night sky, cloaked in soft fog and lit by millions of city lights that blinked like stars fallen to earth. Inside the grand ballroom of the Caledonia historic five-star hotel, nestled just off Michigan Avenue, the air buzzed with refinement and quiet power. Crystal chandeliers bathed the room in gold. Soft classical music swirled between the clinking of champagne flutes and murmurs of well-rehearsed pleasantries. Tonight wasn't just another gala. This was the Blake Foundation's annual Hope Gala, a philanthropic event led by Jonathan Blake himself. The founder and CEO of Blake Biotech, one of the most successful pharmaceutical companies in the country. To his peers, Jonathan Blake was the image of composure and command. Tall, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, always immaculately dressed. His public reputation was impeccable: visionary entrepreneur, generous benefactor, widowed father to one son. He stood on the podium beneath a cascade of golden light, offering practiced smiles and firm handshakes as he introduced a highlight reel of the foundation's recent work. Cancer research funding, children's hospitals, scholarships for underprivileged youth. The crowd responded on cue, with polite applause and nods of admiration. Everything about the evening was polished: every word, every gesture, every inch of space rehearsed for perfection. But beneath that practiced smile, few could guess the storm Jonathan Blake carried within. Because while his voice spoke of hope and healing, his heart was somewhere else entirely. In a dim, quiet room just 20 blocks away, his only child Jacob sat slumped in a wheelchair, barely speaking, barely eating, and barely alive in spirit. A devastating car accident had not only crushed the boy's spine, but also extinguished something far more fragile: the light behind his eyes. That night, as Jonathan addressed the guests, he was simply performing. His soul wasn't there. As the applause faded and guests returned to their seats, Jonathan glanced briefly toward the back of the room, instinctively searching for a sense of something real, something unfiltered. What he found instead was silence and then something utterly unexpected. A voice rang out, small but piercing, raw enough to cut through the layers of classical music, and murmured pleasantries like a knife through satin. "Mr. Blake, I think I can help your son walk again." The room froze. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Utensils clinked to a halt on china plates. Every head turned in unison toward the entrance of the ballroom. There she stood, a little girl 8 years old at most, wearing a threadbare hoodie far too thin for the Chicago winter. Her sneakers were soaked, one lace dragging behind her. Her hair was matted under a knit beanie. She looked like she had stepped in from another universe, a place of cold street corners, back alley soup kitchens, and lives mostly ignored. Security moved in quickly. 2 men in black suits began making their way through the guests' eyes, locked on the girl. Someone in the crowd laughed awkwardly. Someone else whispered, "How did she even get in here?" But Jonathan Blake didn't move. He stared at the child, as if he were looking at a ghost or a memory, something half-real, because for the briefest moment, in that child's trembling voice, he heard something he hadn't heard in months. Clift Hope. And something else too. Recognition. The girl's eyes locked on his, pleading but steady. She wasn't crying, wasn't flailing. She stood there, small, trembling but fiercely present. "I'm not lying," she added, louder this time. "I know someone who can help your son." Guests shifted uncomfortably. One older gentleman coughed and muttered something about calling CPS. A woman at table 9 shook her head in disapproval. The gala was slipping into chaos. The conductor tried to gesture for the quartet to play again, but no one was paying attention. Jonathan gave the slightest of nods to his head of security. The guards approached the girl more gently now, still firm, but without force. "Sweetheart, this isn't a place for—" "I'm not here to play," she interrupted, her voice cracking. "I just wanted to tell him before it's too late." They guided her toward the exit gently, carefully but with unmistakable finality. She didn't fight, but she turned her head back one last time. Their eyes met again, and in that fleeting gaze, Jonathan saw something he could neither understand nor explain. A knowing, not the manipulation of a child coached by an adult. Not a cry for attention, but a message. One that had traveled across class, noise, and circumstance, to land in front of him like a dropped note from the universe itself. And just like that, she was gone. The music started again. The guests returned to their seats. Someone made a joke to ease the tension. The mood shifted back to its performative elegance. But Jonathan Blake felt something fractured inside. He stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, staring at the ballroom's grand entrance long after the girl had disappeared through it. His hands, though steady, felt colder. The speech he was supposed to deliver next was forgotten. The laughter and toasts behind him blurred into a dull hum. Because for the first time in over a year, someone had dared to break through the polite silence surrounding his son's condition. Not with money, not with medicine, but with a raw, impossible promise, and a pair of eyes that somehow knew the truth he had buried. That night, as the gala wound to its scripted end and Jonathan returned to his penthouse, he did not turn on the news or review financial projections. He sat alone in the dark, the city lights flickering like stars he no longer believed in, and replayed her words over and over again. I think I can help your son walk again. A foolish thing to say, a child's fantasy. And yet, for the first time in months, Jonathan Blake felt something he didn't quite recognize. Doubt. Doubt. The kind that stirs just before a storm. And something else. Deeper still, an ache that would not let go. As he loosened his tie and sat in the stillness of his living room, one question refused to leave him. Who was that girl? And why did he believe her? The answer, or the need to chase it, was already beginning to pull him toward a road he had never imagined he would walk. And in the distance, something was changing. No one remembered how she got into the ballroom. Not the security guard at the staff entrance. Not the catering manager. Not the volunteers at the donation table. No camera angle could trace her entrance cleanly. It was as if the city itself had opened a crack just wide enough for her to slip through. Emily Claire Dawson, 8 years old. No mother. No records of her father. She lived in a trailer at the edge of South Lawndale, just beyond the reach of Chicago's polished skyline, where the concrete is cracked and the school buses always seem to be running late. No one came looking for her at night. No one asked where she went during the day. But Emily remembered things. She remembered everything, especially that winter afternoon. Nearly a year ago, when a luxury van pulled up outside the rundown shelter, where she and a dozen other kids were waiting for whatever scraps the world might offer them that day. Out stepped a man in a dark coat, and a boy her age, blonde hair, bright blue eyes, holding boxes of hot meals like they were treasure. The man was Jonathan Blake, and the boy, smiling gently, as he handed her a warm container with mashed potatoes and meatloaf, was Jacob. He had crouched down to her eye level and said, "This one's still hot, be careful." His voice was kind. His eyes were gentle. No one had ever looked at her that way before, not like she mattered. She had said thank you in a whisper, then ran off, cheeks red not from cold, but from something she didn't have a word for. Dignity. Since that moment, Emily hadn't forgotten them. She remembered the heat from the container warming her fingers. The way Jacob's smile seemed to glow despite the frost in the air. To a hungry child, it wasn't just food, it was proof that someone out there still cared. So when word started to drift through the community, whispers from volunteers, rumors from shelter staff that the same boy, Jacob Blake, had been in a terrible accident and hadn't spoken or walked in over a year, something sparked inside her. Not pity, not panic, but urgency. She had to help. Not because she was told to, not because she owed them, but because something inside her said she could. Emily had seen something most people would scoff at. She'd seen a leg swollen and useless, on a neighbor suddenly restored after a few visits to an old man named Eli Carter, Appalachian herbalist who lived off-grid near the Tennessee border. He wasn't a doctor, not in the hospital sense. He didn't have a white coat or a stethoscope, but people around the shelters spoke his name in hushed tones, like a secret you only shared if you really needed it. And Emily had believed it. Not because she wanted to, but because she had seen it work. So when she overheard that Jonathan Blake was speaking at a charity gala to do with hospitals and children, she made a decision. She waited. She followed. And somehow, she got in. Through a service door left cracked open. Past the servers in their white jackets. Past the velvet ropes and polished marble. No one saw her, because no one ever did. But tonight, she had something to say. Her plan was never about chaos. It wasn't to shock or embarrass. She just wanted him to hear her, before it was too late. Before he gave up. Before Jacob gave up. She knew she'd only get one chance. One moment to scream through the noise of a world that never looked her way. And she did. And then she was gone. They pulled her gently into the hallway. Past the curious eyes and awkward silence. The ballroom doors closed behind her with a soft, final click. She stood in the lobby beneath the towering ceilings, staring at the velvet carpet, trying not to cry. But she didn't regret it. Not for a second. Because she saw his eyes. Just for a moment, She saw Jonathan Blake stop. Not just in step, but in spirit. She had gotten through to him. Maybe not enough. Maybe not yet. But she had landed. That was more than anyone had ever given her. Outside, the wind howled along the boulevard. The night air bit into her cheeks as she stepped back into the real world, where luxury limos gleamed under streetlights and doormen pretended not to stare. Emily pulled her hoodie tighter, walked back down Michigan Avenue past the golden windows and glowing boutiques, back toward the city's forgotten edge. She didn't know if he would remember her, but she knew this. She had told the truth, and sometimes the truth, spoken at the right time, can echo far longer than a scream. Back inside the ballroom, Jonathan sat in silence long after the guests resumed their chatter. His hands rested on the tablecloth, untouched wine before him. That child so small, so uninvited had cut through all his layers of logic and grief with one raw, impossible statement. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she came from, but he couldn't shake the look in her eyes, because it wasn't just the look of a child with nothing to lose. It was the look of someone who had seen something. And suddenly, in a world filled with experts and charts and sterile diagnoses, that kid felt like the most honest thing he'd witnessed in a long time. The next morning, Jonathan Blake opened his calendar, stared at his packed schedule, then closed the laptop without saying a word. He turned to his assistant. "Find that girl," he said quietly. His assistant blinked. "What girl?" "The one from last night." Silence. "I don't care how long it takes," he added. "Just start looking." Somewhere far from the boardrooms and banquet halls, a little girl was walking home through the cold, holding on to the fragile thread of hope that maybe he had listened on. And so the search began. For a nameless child in a city of millions. A search not just for her but for something far harder to find. Faith. And just beyond the edge of reason, a door had begun to creak open. A story was beginning to stir. One that no one, certainly not Jonathan Blake, could have ever predicted. But deep down, he already knew. Something in his life had just changed forever. The penthouse on the 52nd floor of the Blake Tower offered the kind of view people paid fortunes just to glimpse. Lake Michigan stretching out like a frozen ocean. City lights glittering like diamonds below. Inside, everything floors, handcrafted walnut furniture, oil paintings lit with precision. It was the kind of home you'd expect from a man like Jonathan Blake. But no matter how warm the lighting, the space always felt cold, especially at night. It had been that way ever since the accident. Jonathan sat alone in his living room. Tie loosened, jacket draped over a leather armrest. A half-empty tumbler of scotch sat untouched beside him. He wasn't drinking. He hadn't been able to for a while. Not since the guilt started to sink in deep enough to turn every drop bitter. Memory was sharp. Too sharp. 1 year ago, a snowy Saturday morning, Jacob, his only son, was bouncing with energy to get to his martial arts class. Jonathan was running late for a conference call with a partner in Tokyo, so he handed the keys to the driver, kissed his son's head distractedly, and said, "We'll have lunch after." "Okay, buddy." He never made it to lunch. Somewhere on Route 41, a truck lost control. The driver survived. Jacob did too, but barely. The doctors called it a miracle. He'd live, they said, but he might never walk again, might never regain full use of his lower limbs, and worse, something had retreated inside the Boyson thing that no scan could see, and no surgery could fix. From that day forward, Jacob had stopped being a child. He stopped speaking, stopped smiling, stopped responding to anything, even to his father's voice. Jonathan had tried everything. He flew in specialists from Switzerland, therapists from Boston, neuro-rehab experts from Stanford. He bought machines, attended private clinics, converted a wing of their home into a therapy center. But the results were always the same. No progress, no spark, just silence. It wasn't just the accident that had broken his son. It was the loss of something deeper. Trust in the world, in his own body, in hope itself. And maybe, Jonathan thought, he had been the one to cause it. He had spent so many years building his empire. Blake Biotech, the research centers, the foundations, the fortune covers. He was praised for his innovations, applauded for his leadership. But none of those accolades could reach a 9-year-old boy sitting motionless in a wheelchair, staring at nothing. That there were nights when Jonathan stood at the door of Jacob's room, hand on the knob, unable to go inside. He would listen to the soft hum of medical equipment, the gentle click of the wheels on the floor as the night nurse adjusted the boy's blanket. He used to imagine Jacob laughing in his sleep. Now, He just prayed for any sound at all. The penthouse had become a mausoleum. Every mirror seemed to reflect not his face, but the failures he couldn't hide anymore. And worst of all, no one around him noticed. Not really. Because people like Jonathan Blake weren't supposed to grieve, not publicly. He was the man with all the answers. The one who donated millions to save other children, while quietly losing his own. The press never wrote about that. They wrote about the company's record profits, the new migraine drug, the keynote speech at the medical summit in Vienna. Not the man who sat by his son's bedside at 3 a.m., whispering old bedtime stories just to feel less alone. Not the father who hadn't heard his child say dad in over 400 days, though when the girl Amelie appeared at the gala, something primal cracked open inside him. She didn't offer money. She didn't beg. She didn't even ask for help. She simply said, "I think I can help your son walk again." That absurd sentence had rattled Jonathan more than any data point ever could, because it wasn't just what she said. It was how she said it, with no fear, with no doubt, with the kind of certainty only children and the truly desperate ever allow themselves to carry. He hadn't been able to stop thinking about her. The eyes, the voice, the impossible conviction. That night, even as the city slept beneath a quilt of frost, Jonathan had sat in Jacob's room for hours, watching, waiting, hoping for the slightest movement. Nothing. Still, her words echoed. He had money, power, resources. Everything society said should make a man feel in control, and yet, here he was. Helpless. Every medical report said Jacob was stable. But Jacob wasn't living. He was surviving. And deep inside, Jonathan knew something had to change. He couldn't keep going like this. He couldn't keep pretending he had done all he could, because maybe, just maybe, he hadn't. Maybe the answer wasn't in another white paper, or a high-tech clinic, or a conference call with someone from Johns Hopkins. Maybe it was somewhere else entirely, somewhere no spreadsheet could calculate. That next morning, as the sunlight crept through the frosted windows, Jonathan stood by the kitchen window, sipping burnt coffee he barely tasted. His assistant entered, tablet in hand, eyes a little unsure. "I have people asking if you're still going to DC next week for the NIH conference," she said. He didn't answer, and ... "About last night. You asked me to look into that girl." She paused. "I had my team check security footage, but we don't have a name, no ID, no ticket, just a hoodie, sneakers, and those words. I can help your son." Jonathan turned, slowly. "I want to find her," he said. "I understand," she replied, but even she didn't. Not really, because Jonathan Blake wasn't chasing a child. He was chasing a whisper, a flicker of hope in the ruins of logic. And for the first time, in his long, calculated career, he was ready to follow something he couldn't explain. As the day wore on, calls went unanswered. Emails were flagged for later. The board could wait. The shareholders could wait. But the ache in a father's heart could not. And in the quiet hours that followed, Jonathan made a decision. He would find her, whoever she was, whatever it took, because, somewhere, behind those young eyes, she carried a message that pierced deeper than science, and, if there was even the slightest truth behind it, he had to know. He just had to. The next step would lead him away from boardrooms and into places he'd never imagined, into forgotten corners and toward a name he had never heard. Eli Carter. But that, too, was coming. Because the road to healing doesn't always begin with answers. Sometimes, it begins with surrender. Chicago moved fast. Its skyline soared on ambition. Its streets pulsed with purpose. But for the first time in years, Jonathan Blake slowed down. No private driver, no security escort, no destination marked on the calendar. Just him, behind the wheel of a sleek black SUV, driving aimlessly through streets he hadn't thought about in decades. He left the business district behind, its steel and glass fading into the brick and rust of old neighborhoods. His hands, steady in boardrooms, gripped the steering wheel tighter as the buildings grew smaller, the sidewalks rougher, the shadows longer. He passed by shuttered diners, corner stores with peeling signs, and playgrounds with swings that creaked in the wind. He didn't belong here, and he knew it. But he wasn't here to belong. He was looking for a girl no one had noticed, and a promise no one could explain. Her face had imprinted on him like a photo burned into film. The knitted hat, the eyes too old for 8 years, the voice that cut through the Gala like truth through velvet. She had said she could help his son. And somehow, Jonathan believed her. He started at shelters, the kind his foundation had quietly funded for tax credits. He asked questions. cautious at first, then more direct. No one knew the girl by name. Some remembered a kid like that, quiet, fast, always alone. Might be the Dawson girl, someone finally muttered. Trailer park, southeast edge near the overpass. Doesn't talk much. Smart. Though, that was enough. Jonathan drove deeper, past the city's skin and into its bones. The Blake Tower felt like another planet, now distant, irrelevant. Here, houses were patched with plywood and prayers. Old tires lined driveways. Smoke curled from barrels instead of chimneys. This wasn't just poverty. It was survival. Then he saw her. She was sitting beneath a rusted aluminum awning beside a scrapyard, sorting crushed soda cans into buckets. Her jacket was too thin. Her hands were red with cold. But her posture, her focus was unwavering. As if the smallness of her task didn't matter. As if something larger lived inside her. Jonathan pulled over and stepped out slowly. He didn't want to frighten her. But she had already noticed him. She looked up without flinching. Their eyes met again, and something passed between them, not surprise, not fear. Recognition. She stood. He hesitated. Then he spoke, quieter than he expected. Your name is Emily, isn't it? She nodded once. You're Jacob's dad. He swallowed the lump in his throat. Yes, I am. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Wind rustled through the chain-link fence behind her. Somewhere nearby, a radio crackled a country tune through static. Emily wiped her hands on her jeans and stepped forward. Not running, not hiding, just waiting. Why did you say that? Jonathan asked. At the gala, why did you say you could help him? Emily's voice was calm but urgent. Because I meant it. Jonathan knelt slightly to meet her eyes. Who told you to say that? Was someone using you? Was it for money? No, she replied, too quickly to be rehearsed. I didn't want anything. I still don't. He searched her face, looking for signs of manipulation. There were none. Just the stubborn truth of a child who had nothing to lose. Then who can help him? He asked. Her eyes flickered. His name is Eli. Eli Carter. He lives down near the mountains. Tennessee side. He's not a doctor, but he helps people when doctors can't. He helped my neighbor's leg. She couldn't walk for weeks. Hospitals gave up. Eli gave her herbs and talked to her. A week later, she was moving again. Jonathan blinked. Herbs. She nodded. Not just that. It's how he talks to people. Like he sees inside them. It sounded ridiculous. Preposterous. A Wall Street executive would have laughed her off the curb. But Jonathan Blake wasn't a CEO today. He was a father with nothing left to try. Emily took a breath and added, I remember Jacob. From last year. He gave me food outside the shelter. He smiled at me like I mattered. No one does that. I want to give him something back. I think Eli could help. The words hung in the air. Raw, honest, impossible. Jonathan felt something shift inside him, a slow, quiet loosening of logic. He had spent a year praying for a door. This girl had cracked open a window, and he wasn't ready to shut it. He exhaled. Would you come with me? She hesitated, then nodded. Yes. But we'll have to go soon. Eli's not the type. You schedule. The next morning, Jonathan Blake did something his staff had never seen before. He cleared his calendar without explanation. A sleek SUV pulled up to his penthouse, not to take him to the airport, or a gala, or a conference, but to pick up a little girl in a borrowed jacket, with hair tied back by a rubber band. They drove together in silence at first, past the city limits, then south through the flatlands. The highways thinning until road signs began pointing toward Knoxville, and the shadows of mountains began appearing like folded dreams on the horizon. Jacob sat in the back, in his wheelchair, staring out the window. He had resisted the trip at first with silence, then with quiet tears. But something in his father's voice must have reached him. Or maybe it was Emily. Her presence was unspoken but grounding, like a dogged little flame refusing to go out. She didn't try to make him talk. She just sat nearby. Quiet, present. Enough. As the SUV turned off the main highway onto a narrower, bumpier road, the trees thickened. Fog hugged the hills. The air changed cooler, older, quieter. Emily looked out the window, then pointed. That's it. The house wasn't a house. It was a cabin. Wooden, weathered, tucked beneath a canopy of oak trees that looked older than memory. A small garden spread out beside it, full of plants Jonathan couldn't name. A wind chime made from bones and bottle caps swayed on the porch. It was the kind of place you'd pass on a road trip without ever stopping. But Jonathan Blake had stopped. Because inside that cabin lived the man who might hold something modern medicine never could. As Emily stepped out and led the way up the path, Jonathan followed behind, Jacob's wheelchair bumping gently over the stone walkway. He could feel the skepticism rising again, the part of his brain that still measured risk and ROI. But another voice, quieter, older, whispered something else. Sometimes the way forward doesn't begin with understanding. It begins with humility. And as the front door creaked open, and a figure stepped out, tall, bearded, eyes like weathered glass, Jonathan knew he had just crossed into the unknown, and he wasn't turning back. The air smelled of wet earth and wood smoke. A thin veil of mist drifted between the trees like the ghosts of old stories. As Jonathan wheeled Jacob toward the cabin, the landscape seemed to hum with something unspoken, something ancient. The man who stepped out to greet them looked like he had been carved from the same Appalachian stone that surrounded his home. Eli Carter stood tall, but weathered, lean but sturdy. His silver hair spilled beneath a beaten felt hat, and his eyes, clear, blue, still held the calm weight of someone who had spent more time listening than speaking. Emily stepped forward. "First, Mr. Eli," she said, her voice soft, reverent. He gave a nod. "You brought company." She nodded back. "This is Jacob, and his dad." Eli's eyes moved to Jonathan. They didn't judge. They didn't challenge. They simply saw. Jonathan extended a hand, but Eli didn't take it immediately. He looked down at Jacob first, quietly, letting the moment breathe. The boy, motionless in his chair, stared straight ahead, his face unreadable. "Come on inside," Eli finally said. "It's chilly today." The inside of the cabin was simple. Wood walls, faded rugs, shelves lined with jars of dried herbs, roots, and things Jonathan couldn't begin to identify. A single rocking chair faced a cast iron stove. The place smelled of pine, lemon balm, and faint traces of smoke. Jonathan felt the skepticism rise again, a habitual instinct built from years of boardrooms and protocols. Everything about this man, this place, this so-called medicine, contradicted the precision-driven world he came from. But then, Eli did something no specialist had ever done. He didn't ask for charts. He didn't ask for scans. He didn't even ask for a medical history. He simply knelt beside Jacob's chair slowly, gently, and placed one weathered hand on the boy's shoulder. No words, just presence. Jacob flinched slightly, but he didn't pull away. Eli sat back on his heels and studied the boy. Not with the eyes of a clinician, but with the eyes of someone trying to hear what hadn't been spoken in a very long time. After a long moment, he spoke. His voice was gravel and warmth. "His body's hurt," he said quietly. "But that's not what's keeping him from walking." Jonathan said nothing. Eli turned his gaze on him. "It's his spirit. It's folded up, locked down. Fear does that. Grief does too." Jonathan swallowed, unsure how to respond. Eli stood, slow and deliberate, then walked toward a small side room. "He won't heal the way doctors expect," he called back, "because he's not broken in the way they know how to fix." A few minutes later, Eli returned with a pouch of herbs and 2 small clay cups. "Steep this," he said to Jonathan. "Not for his legs, for his nerves. For rest. He needs to sleep without dreams chasing him." Jonathan took the pouch, uncertain but respectful. Eli turned to Emily next. "Stay close to him, all right? You know how to just be. That's what he needs." Emily nodded. The rest of the afternoon passed in quiet rhythms. Eli spoke little, but when he did, his words felt measured, like stones placed with care into a riverbed. He taught them how to make salves from yarrow and comfrey, how to steep wild mint for calm, how to watch for signs, not in the body, but in the eyes. "That's where pain truly lived," he said. "Not always in the bones. Sometimes in the silence." He never forced Jacob to do anything. No exercises, no drills. He simply invited the boy outside, showed him how bees moved toward lavender, how the wind moved the tall grass like waves, how a seed, even crushed, could find a way to rise. Every moment was a lesson wrapped in simplicity. And slowly, barely noticeably at first, something began to shift. Jacob's gaze started to follow things. His hands began to move, not out of instruction, but out of curiosity. Once, as Eli played a wooden flute on the porch, Jonathan saw Jacob's eyelids flutter, not in sleep, but in feeling. It wasn't medicine in the traditional sense. It was something else, something slower, deeper. It was the kind of healing that doesn't ask, doesn't demand, doesn't expect. It simply waits. Jonathan had built his entire life around action. diagnosis, decision, results. But here, there was no timetable. No guarantees. Only patience. Only presence. And for the first time, perhaps in his entire adult life, he understood the difference between treating and healing. That night, as the fire crackled low, and Jacob slept peacefully, quietly, Jonathan stepped outside. The stars were brighter here, fierce and unapologetic. He looked up at the sky and let out a long breath, one that carried years of weight. Eli joined him, holding 2 mugs of steaming herbal tea. "I don't know what I'm doing," Jonathan confessed. Eli sipped, then replied without looking at him, "Good. Means you might finally learn something." Jonathan chuckled, dry and honest. "This wasn't in any book I've ever read." "No," Eli said. "Books don't always carry what the soul needs." Jonathan turned to him. "Can he really get better?" Eli finally looked at him again, and this time, there was a fire in those blue eyes. "I don't know," he said, "but I know this. You've spent a year doing everything a man could. Now it's time to be the thing he needs most." "What's that?" "A father who's not afraid to hope." The next morning, Jonathan didn't check his phone. He didn't call the board. He didn't think about earnings reports, stock values, or quarterly projections. He poured tea. He sat with his son, and he waited for the wind to change. There were no white coats, no CLIPBOARDS, no fluorescent lights humming overhead. In Eli Carter's world, healing didn't arrive with fanfare. It arrived like morning mist, soft, slow, and nearly invisible. Jonathan Blake had expected change too. Look dramatic. He thought there would be some moment of epiphany. Some clear sign like in the movies where Jacob would suddenly blink, speak, stand, and everything would rush back like a dam finally bursting. But that wasn't how it happened. Instead, it began with a glance. Just a glance. 4 days into their stay, as the sun filtered through the lace curtain of the cabin's small living room, Jacob looked at Emily. Not past her. At her. It lasted 2 seconds. Maybe less. But it was the first time his eyes had chosen to land on someone, not just drift through them. Jonathan had been making tea by the stove. He didn't see it at first, but Emily did. And when she gently said, "Hi, Jacob," his lower lip twitched, with speech, but with awareness, and that was everything. From that point on, healing didn't rise like a tide. It flickered like candlelight, tiny, stubborn flames refusing to die. Eli never rushed him. He didn't issue commands. He didn't coax or plead. He simply offered routine. Every morning began with warm broth, then silent walks through the forest trail. Jacob rolled slowly beside him in the wheelchair, as Eli pointed out, the way moss grows toward water, or how hawks circle when rain is near. There was no language for most of it, but Jacob began to notice. He noticed the way Emily skipped over stones. He noticed the soft clink of Eli's spoon in his teacup. He noticed when the fire popped too loudly and flinched, just slightly, like his nervous system had remembered how to protect itself. Jonathan noticed too. Noticed how Jacob now tilted his head toward sound. How his fingers flexed just a bit when music played. How his jaw unclenched during sleep. But what surprised Jonathan most was how he began to change. The man who once measured success in quarterly margins, now found himself watching wind patterns. He listened, and not just with ears, but with heart. He sat in long silences beside his son and didn't feel the need to fill them. He learned to be still. It was, in many ways, the first therapy he had ever received. One afternoon, Emily brought out a small clay flute Eli had made for her. It wasn't perfectly tuned. Its sound was light, breathy, raw. She played a soft, wandering melody, part lullaby, part question. Jacob sat quietly beside her, eyes half-lidded. Then, in the middle of a phrase, his hand moved. Not much, just a finger brushing the edge of his blanket in rhythm. Emily stopped playing. Her eyes widened. She looked to Jonathan, who had frozen mid-step in the doorway. "Do it again," he whispered. She played the same notes, gentle, trembling, and there it was, a second brush. A response. Tears came quick and sudden. Not loud, not performative, just real. The kind that sting because they come from a place too deep for words. Jonathan turned away, biting his fist just to keep from collapsing into the moment. He had forgotten how fragile hope could feel when it finally returns. From that day forward, the little things mattered more. Jacob began reaching for spoons, for leaves, for light. His legs didn't move. His voice didn't return. But his will to engage had awoken. And Emily, she became more than just a companion. She became his tether. She read to him. She talked to him like nothing was wrong. She made jokes, bad ones, mostly, and giggled at her own punchlines until he smiled. Just the corner of his mouth. But it was real that there was a grace in her presence. The kind only someone who's been invisible truly understands. She didn't try to fix him. She sat with him. And sometimes, that's the rarest medicine of all. Eli, observing from the porch, said little. But one evening, as the stars bled into the sky, and the three of them sat beneath a quilt of crickets and wind, he finally said, "The body follows the spirit, and the spirit follows presence." Jonathan asked, "So you think he's coming back?" Eli didn't smile. He just said, "I think he never left. He just got too quiet for you to hear." That night, Jacob slept soundly again, and in his sleep, he moved his hand once clenched for months and folded against the pillow, and Jonathan, watching from the bedside chair, reached out and held it. There were no grand revelations, no thunderous transformation, but in that moment, in the stillness, between two heartbeats, our father began to believe again. He no longer asked when his son would speak or walk, or smile fully. He simply stayed close enough to catch whatever came next. And something was coming, because in the quiet spaces, in the small reaches of motion and breath, life was finding its way back. It didn't need permission, only patience, and someone willing to witness the return. The mountains never announced the seasons. They simply shifted silently, steadily, until one morning, the air felt different, and you realized winter had stepped back and spring had taken its place. So it was with Jacob. No ceremony, no sudden burst of motion. Just a quiet moment that didn't feel like a miracle until you looked back and realized it was Dot. It was early morning. Mist still curled around the tree trunks, and the dew clung to every blade of grass like tiny crystals waiting for sunlight. Inside the cabin, the fire had just started to flicker, and Emily was sitting on the floor, gently brushing color into a sketch of the forest she'd been working on for days. Jacob was beside her, propped slightly with cushions, his blanket tucked up beneath his arms. He'd been more present lately, watching, following, but he hadn't spoken not a single word in over 14 months. Emily was humming, softly and without structure, half lullaby, half daydream. She dipped her brush into the jar and asked, without looking up, "What color do you think the flowers should be?" It was rhetorical. She talked to fill space, never expecting him to answer. Not anymore. But then she heard it, a sound, small, dry, like wind catching a paper leaf. She turned her head, heart stilled mid-beat. Jacob's lips were parted, just slightly. His eyes, wide and trembling, were looking at the page. "What color are they?" The words weren't smooth. They cracked in the middle, like they'd been trapped behind years of rusted silence. But they were real, and they were his. Emily dropped the brush, gasping, not out of fear, but awe. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She just sat there, blinking fast, before whispering back, "Yellow. I was thinking yellow." Jacob blinked too. Then almost imperceptibly, he smiled. Upstairs, Jonathan had been on a call he wasn't really listening to, staring out the window at the canopy of trees. When he heard the thud of the brush, the gasp, and the soft, breathless shuffle of Emily's voice, something inside him shifted. He moved fast. Fast like a man who's lived on edge for too long. He turned the corner of the stairs and saw them, her, frozen in place. Him still, eyes alert. "What happened?" he asked, his voice almost cracking from anticipation. Emily didn't look at him. She looked at Jacob. "Tell him." And Jacob, this boy who hadn't spoken in over a year, turned toward his father. "The flowers," he said. "They should be yellow." Jonathan froze. His knees nearly gave. His breath caught, like it was snagged on a jagged edge. He walked slowly, carefully, like the floor might collapse under the weight of what had just happened. And then he did the one thing he hadn't done in months. He knelt down and held his son's face in both hands, not with fear or pressure, but with full presence. "You're here," he whispered. Jacob nodded, a single deliberate nod. Later on the porch, Jonathan sat beside Eli with a mug of tea that had gone cold long ago. "He spoke," he said, as if still trying to convince himself. "I know," Eli replied, rocking gently, eyes fixed on the horizon. "What does it mean?" Eli didn't answer right away. He let the wind fill the space between them. "Then, it means his spirit's not folded anymore, just waking up." Jonathan looked down at his hands. They were shaking, not with fear, but with release. He'd spent over a year chasing experts, data solutions, and here, in a wooden cabin with no Wi-Fi, no degrees on the wall, his son had taken his first step, not with his legs, But with his voice, it wasn't the kind of progress you could quantify. But it was the kind that mattered most in the days that followed. More whispers came. Jacob started humming when Emily painted. He tapped his fingers to the rhythm of Eli's flute. He said goodnight one evening, out of nowhere, and every time he spoke, even just a word, it was like the wind had shifted slightly and brought spring closer. Emily stayed close, never overstepping, never drawing attention. She wasn't the hero of the moment. She was the witness, and in her quiet way, she held space for the boy who had once disappeared inside himself. Jonathan, changed. He stopped checking his phone. He stopped waiting for reports. He stopped needing proof. He started listening. To the trees, to the silences, to the small voice of his son, that day by day was finding its way back. There were no headlines, no viral videos, just a boy who had once been silent, whispering his way back into life, and a father who had once lost faith, finally learning how to believe in things unseen. But as the days grew warmer, and Jacob grew bolder, a storm was gathering far from the mountain cabin. In the glass towers of Chicago, forces Jonathan had left behind were stirring. A challenge was coming, one that would test how far he was willing to go for his son, and how much he was willing to lose. But for now, in that fragile space between winter and spring, they had one thing that had been missing for far too long. They had hope, and for the first time in over a year, it was speaking back. Chicago didn't wait for anyone, while Jonathan Blake walked forest trails and brewed tea in a cabin where cell service barely reached. The city pulsed without him. His name still echoed in boardrooms. His signature still lingered on contracts, but his absence after weeks off the radar was beginning to draw attention. At first, it was whispers, whispers in the corridors of Blake Biotech, concerned glances exchanged in investor meetings, a growing stack of emails marked urgent and for your immediate review, that never received replies. Then came Gregory Vaughn, sleek, sharp, and calculating. Gregory had long been the executive vice president at Blake Biotech, the man who kept the machine running when Jonathan was in the spotlight. He was brilliant, but cold, driven, but impatient. And more than anything, he was ready to take over. He'd waited in the shadows for years, watching as Jonathan softened, watching as the great innovator turned inward, consumed by personal grief. Gregory knew the board would never betray their founder, not while he was still visible, still present. But Jonathan wasn't present anymore. He was in Tennessee, somewhere, in the woods, with no public updates, no professional appearances, and no explanation for his absence. Rumors were spreading that his mind wasn't right, that the loss of his son had broken him, that the company needed stability. Gregory didn't need a scandal. He just needed a vacuum. And now, he had one. At a hastily organized shareholder briefing, he presented charts, lines dipping subtly but ominously. Production delays, missed regulatory filings. Minor, but enough to stoke fear. Enough to suggest that without decisive leadership, the company's momentum could slip. The board listened. And then, the real play. Gregory offered a temporary transition of oversight. A calm, rational move to support Jonathan during his family crisis. It sounded compassionate, reasonable, but it was a coup dressed in silk. And the moment the board approved it, Blake Biotech was no longer Jonathan Blake's company. He didn't know it yet. Back in the mountains, he was kneeling beside Jacob, helping him trace letters in the dirt. The boy had begun to write again, slowly, shakily. His motor control wasn't perfect, but he was trying. His eyes had life in them now. His voice, though quiet, returned in short, clear bursts. His favorite word, lately, was again. Let's try again. Dad. Can we read it again? It was everything Jonathan had hoped for, until the call finally broke through. The signal had been weak all morning, but the notification came through, during a rare hike near the ridge. A voicemail, then another, then a breaking news alert. He didn't want to listen, but he knew he had to. The message was short, clean, ruthless. Gregory's voice, smooth as always. Jonathan, I hope this finds you well. The board has made a decision. Given your extended leave and lack of communication, I've stepped in as acting CEO. We'll hold things steady for you. For now, there was no anger in the words. Just erasure. It hit harder than he expected. Jonathan stood alone on the edge of a clearing, his phone clutched in one hand, the wind rising behind him like a whisper of warning. He wasn't just being replaced, he was being removed, not with cruelty, but with indifference. And somehow, That hurt more. He walked back to the cabin, in silence. Later that evening, Eli noticed the tension in his face, the slump in his shoulders. He waited until the kids had gone to bed before he spoke. "You heard something," Eli said, pouring 2 cups of tea. Jonathan nodded. "They've taken the company. You surprised?" Jonathan shook his head slowly. "Not really. I left it too long. I disappeared." Eli sipped his tea. "You were showing up somewhere else." Jonathan looked toward the bedroom where Jacob slept. "I was," he whispered. "And now I feel like I'm losing everything else." Eli leaned back in his chair. "So maybe it's time to ask what's actually worth keeping." The question landed with a quiet finality. What was worth keeping? The skyscrapers, the accolades, the control, or the boy asleep in the next room, who had just started speaking again? He stayed up most of the night, pacing the porch, the stars above sharp and quiet. Every part of him, the executive, the father, the builder, was at war. He had come to the mountains to save his son, but saving him might mean losing everything else. And the truth was, he didn't know which part of him would survive it. At sunrise, he sat beside Jacob's bed, watching the boy sleep, his chest rising in a steady rhythm. His hand curled around a worn stuffed bear. Jonathan whispered, "I'm still here, son. No matter what they take, I'm still yours." And for the first time since the call, he knew what mattered. It wasn't the board. It wasn't the building with his name on it. It was this room, this boy, this moment. The rest could wait. But time would not. Because storms don't ask if you're ready. They come. And when they hit, you find out who you really are. It was just after dawn. The sky over the mountains had only begun to blush, painting soft streaks of gold and rose above the mist-covered trees. Inside the cabin, the world was still, the kind of stillness that feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jonathan stirred first. He was used to waking early now, not by alarm, but by instinct. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't scroll headlines or check the time. He simply sat up on the couch where he'd been sleeping, wrapped in an old quilt, and listened to dot. There was a sound. Faint, rhythmic dot. Not birdsong, not the creak of floorboards. Something different. He stood, walked slowly toward Jacob's room, and stopped at the doorway. What he saw stole the air from his lungs. Jacob was standing, not perfectly, not steadily, but he was standing. One hand gripped the edge of the dresser. His legs were trembling beneath him, thin from months of disuse, knees bent, muscles straining like they were remembering a language they'd long forgotten. His face was focused, not afraid, not panicked, just determined. Emily sat nearby, cross-legged on the floor, eyes wide but calm. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She knew. Jonathan could hardly move. He wanted to rush in, to hold his son, to cry out, but something told him not to break the moment. So he stayed in the doorway, watching the miracle unfold in silence. Jacob lifted one foot. It hovered for a breath. Then it came down, wobbly, off-center, but it landed. Then the other step. He let go of the dresser. He didn't fall. Jonathan couldn't hold it in anymore. A sound escaped him, half sob, half laugh. His hands came to his mouth. His knees buckled, and he dropped into the nearest chair as tears rushed to his eyes, hot and unstoppable. Jacob looked at him and smiled. A real smile. Crooked, sleepy, alive. "Morning, Dad," he said, voice rough but steady. Jonathan covered his face. Overcome. Then, standing, he crossed the room in 3 long strides and dropped to his knees in front of his son. "You're walking," he whispered, as if afraid to say it too loud. Jacob looked down at his legs, then up at his father. "I think so." They both laughed, choked and messy and full of every ounce of joy the last year had tried to take from them. Behind them, Eli appeared in the doorway, silent. He didn't speak, he didn't smile. He just watched, nodding once as if to say, "This is yours now," and it was. The boy who doctors said might never walk again was walking. Not in a hospital. Not with machines. Not because of a miracle, drug, or a $1 billion trial, but because someone had believed, because someone had listened, because someone had waited. Later that morning, Jacob walked outside. It wasn't far, just from the porch to the edge of the yard. Emily walked beside him, careful not to help unless he asked. Eli stood with Jonathan, arms crossed, eyes on the boy as he moved through the sunlight like it was a brand new substance. The wind picked up, brushing through the trees. Birds broke into sudden song. And somewhere in the stillness, the mountain exhaled. It wasn't just a victory of flesh and bone. It was the return of a child to the world. The boy who had disappeared into trauma, into silence, into stillness, was here again, and he had found his way back, not through force or science, or will alone, but through love, through quiet, through the steady, invisible work of presence. Jonathan stood with one hand on his heart, watching his son walk beneath the morning sun. It hit him then hard and humbling that this was the only moment that had ever mattered. Not the speeches, not the prophets, not the legacy. Just this. Just Jacob. The miracle wasn't in the walking. It was in everything that had led to it. The brokenness, the waiting, the voices that refused to give up. And yet, even as the sun rose higher, and laughter filled the yard like water into an empty well, a shadow stretched from the horizon. Jonathan knew. The mountain couldn't hold them forever. There were decisions to be made, truths to confront, and a world waiting beyond the trees, ready to test everything they'd rebuilt. But for now, this morning it was enough to watch his son walk toward him, not away, not in a dream, but here. Alive, and finally free. The days that followed Jacob's first steps were quieter than expected. Not quiet in the way grief had once filled the air like fog, but quiet like a chapel, reverent, tender, steady. The kind of silence that holds something sacred, something too delicate to name out loud. No one rushed him. No one called the press. No one shouted, "He's healed." Instead, they simply lived. Jacob now walked short distances each morning, growing stronger each time. Sometimes he stumbled, and sometimes he fell, but every time, he got back up. Not because anyone pushed him, but because he wanted to. His resilience, long buried under pain and fear, had risen like a tide that no one could stop. One afternoon, as he stood in the garden beside Emily, he reached out and touched a sunflower nearly as tall as he was. "She grew fast," he said. Emily smiled. "So did you." Jonathan watched from the porch, his heart stretched between disbelief and deep, wordless gratitude. That night, after the dishes were done and the fire was low, he sat across from Eli at the kitchen table. The same question had been sitting in his chest for days, and now, finally, he let it out. "What happens next?" Eli took a slow sip of his tea. "You go home." Jonathan hesitated. "To the company." Eli shook his head. "No, to your home. Wherever that is now." Jonathan looked down. "I'm not sure I know anymore." "Yes, you do," Eli replied gently. "It's the place where your boy found his voice again. It's wherever you choose not to run from anymore." The words hung in the air like lanterns, illuminating more than just the room. Jonathan nodded slowly. Later that week, they packed. The cabin felt different now. Not smaller, but fuller. It had become something sacred, a space of rebirth, of quiet revolution. But it wasn't meant to be permanent. Eli stood by the truck as they loaded the last bag. He looked at Jacob, who now stood without assistance, hands in his pockets like any other 9-year-old boy. "You've got a strong wind in you," Eli said. "Don't waste it." Jacob nodded. "Thank you for helping me hear it." Then, Eli turned to Emily. "You going with them?" he asked. Emily hesitated. I don't know." Jonathan stepped forward. "You should," he said softly. "If you want to." Emily blinked. "Are you asking me?" "No," he said. "I'm inviting you." She looked up at him, eyes uncertain, voice barely above a whisper. "But I don't belong in that world." Jonathan knelt down beside her, looked her straight in the eyes. "You belonged in ours, long before we even realized it." That night, back in Chicago, the penthouse felt different. Not hollow, not cold, but waiting. Ready. Emily had never seen a place so high off the ground. She stared out the window like she might fall up into the sky. But Jacob grabbed her hand and said, "You get used to it." Over the next few days, Jonathan made changes. He didn't reclaim his title at Blake Biotech. Instead, he resigned not with bitterness, but with peace. He handed over full leadership to the new team, but announced one final project, a foundation, funded personally, called Jacob's Garden, a center for alternative healing, natural therapies, and childhood recovery. And at the heart of it, 2 names were etched on the cornerstone: Jacob Blake and Emily Claire Dawson. Because no story ever heals alone. They moved to a smaller home near Lake Geneva, where the air was still clean and the neighbors waved. Emily had her own room. Jacob went back to school. And every Thursday afternoon, the 3 of them sat around the table and painted flowers, trees, skies, whatever came to mind. They were a family now. Not by blood, but by choice. Forged, not through perfection, but through pain, patience, and something deeper than logic. Faith. Faith that love doesn't always look like it's supposed to. Faith that healing can come in silence. Faith that sometimes the people we least expect, a broken child, a grieving father, a girl from the margins, are the ones who end up saving each other. And one spring evening, as they walked together by the water's edge, Jonathan glanced at the two children walking ahead of him, one once lost in silence, the other once invisible to the world, and he smiled. He had spent a lifetime building a kingdom, but only now did he understand what it meant to come home, to walls, not to wealth, but to people, to presence, to peace. And in that quiet moment, with the lake stretching out before them, and the sky painted with the last colors of the day, Jonathan Blake no longer felt like a man trying to outrun loss. He felt like a father, and that was enough. 6 months passed. The headlines had moved on. The business world barely remembered his name. Jonathan Blake was no longer the man on stage at biotech summits, no longer the cover story for innovation and pharmaceutical dominance. His departure had made a brief ripple. Some speculated burnout, others whispered scandal, but the world, as it does, kept spinning. And Jonathan had never felt more alive. He spent his mornings walking with Jacob to school. He made breakfast from scratch. He brewed coffee slowly, not because he had time, but because he finally understood the value of time. He found himself lingering in conversations with the barista, stopping to smell actual flowers, picking up Emily's art supplies without being asked once. These things would have seemed small. Now, they were everything. Success, he realized, had worn 1,000 masks in his life. For decades, it looked like press coverage and corner offices, awards, IPOs, quarterly wins. But none of that ever smiled at him across a breakfast table. None of it whispered goodnight. Dad, with a hand on his arm, he had spent years building something that would outlast him, a company, a legacy. But now, as he sat under a maple tree in the backyard, watching Jacob and Emily chase fireflies barefoot through the grass, he realized, legacy isn't about what outlasts us, it's about who becomes because of us. That thought carried him back to the foundation. Jacob's garden was no longer just an idea on paper. It was becoming real, not a clinic, not a lab, but a space for listening, for slowing down, for remembering that healing isn't always sterile and scripted, that sometimes the most advanced form of care is presence. He brought Eli on as an advisor, not to modernize him, not to commercialize his methods, but to protect the essence of what he offered, an ancient kind of knowing that didn't fit inside grant proposals. They didn't advertise. They didn't pitch to investors. And still, people came. Veterans with invisible wounds, children who'd stopped speaking, mothers lost in grief, people whom the system had labeled resistant, hopeless, non-compliant. Eli would smile and say, "They're not broken. They're just unheard." And Jonathan understood now, more than ever, that the world didn't need more products. It needed more listening, more softness, more people willing to sit in silence with someone else's pain and say, "I see you, and I'm not going anywhere." He no longer wore suits unless he felt like it. Most days, it was jeans and an old sweater. He didn't miss the titles, the pressure, the weight of always being the answer. He had traded the noise of importance for the clarity of meaning, and meaning didn't come from acquisition. It came from connection. One afternoon, Jacob came home from school with a permission slip for a class trip. Jonathan signed it, then paused. As his son walked away, "Hey," he called out. "You know I'm proud of you, right?" Jacob turned, 1 foot on the stairs. "I know," he said, "but I'm proud of you, too." Jonathan sat down at the table and let that sink in. Success, he realized, was never supposed to be about being admired from a distance. It was about being known up close. In the messy, unscripted, fragile way real life works. And for the first time in his life, he no longer measured his worth by what he owned, but by who he could sit with in the quiet and cold family. The world might not remember Jonathan Blake the way it once had, but that was okay, because Jacob remembered. Emily remembered. Eli remembered. And every life touched by the space they'd built, a garden, a home, a refuge, would carry forward something more enduring than fame. They would carry forward proof that sometimes the most powerful transformation doesn't come with applause, but with a whisper. And if anyone ever asked what Jonathan Blake accomplished in the final chapter of his life, they might never mention his net worth, or his patents, or the company that once bore his name. They might just say this: he gave everything up. And in doing so, he finally found what mattered. There are moments in life that leave no photograph, no video, No record. Just memory. And in Jonathan Blake's memory, there is one moment that lives sharper than the rest. Not the IPO, not the first patent, not the night his company crossed $1 billion in valuation. No, it was a pair of eyes. A little girl, soaked in rain, standing in the back of a gilded ballroom, her voice trembling but unbroken as she cried out, "I think I can help your son walk again." Everything had changed in that instant. He hadn't known it then. He hadn't understood what kind of courage it takes for a child with nothing to walk into a room where everything gleamed and dared to speak. But now, he did. Because looking back, that moment hadn't been about science or logic or even medicine. It had been about faith. Blind belief. But the kind of faith that sees through pain, the kind of faith that comes from living in the shadows, yet still believing in the light. Emily had walked into that room invisible. And by the time she left, she had moved something inside him that billion-dollar campaigns never could. She hadn't cured Jacob. She had believed for him when no one else knew how. And that belief had spread into Jonathan, into Eli, into the boy who had all but vanished. And now, years later, Jonathan sometimes found himself staring out the kitchen window as Emily painted in the backyard, her hands steady, her focus complete, her hair catching the wind like strands of flame. She had grown, not into someone new, but into the person she was always meant to be. Someone who changed the world quietly. Someone who never asked to be seen, but who became unforgettable. That fall, the three of them sat beneath a canopy of orange and gold, sipping cider as Jacob told a story from school. Emily laughed at his punchline before he even got to it. Jonathan shook his head, smiling. "Do you remember?" he asked. "The first thing you ever said to me." Emily looked at him, eyes glinting. "I remember what you looked like," she said. "Like a man who had everything except the thing that mattered." Jonathan nodded slowly. "And you saw that?" "I didn't just see it," she replied. "I felt it, and I couldn't ignore it." He reached across the table and took her hand. "Neither could I. There was nothing left to prove. No battles left to win. Only this, a child who found her voice and gave it away like a gift. And a man who, through her, remembered how to feel again. Years would pass. The world would shift. But the moment, that single, uninvited, impossible moment in the back of a grand ballroom, would live on like a stone dropped into water, its ripples still touching lives they'd never even meet. Sometimes, Jonathan would be asked by former colleagues, journalists, curious strangers, what turned it all around. He would think of graphs, of doctors, of therapy schedules. But then, always, he would return to her. To that child, to those eyes, the ones that didn't flinch in the face of power, the ones that carried more wisdom than any boardroom he'd ever sat in. And he would say, "I was saved by a girl no one saw coming." Because that's how change begins. Not with declarations, but with a whisper. Not in brilliance, but in presence. Not in certainty, but in eyes that refused to look away. And in the end, for all he had lost, all he had let go of, Jonathan Blake would carry forward one truth that no market crash, no corporate betrayal, no passage of time could erase. That the smallest voices can carry the loudest truth. That love, offered freely, can rewrite the future. And that one brave child, believing when no one else would, had changed not just his son's life, but his own. Forever.